History of the World by J.M. Roberts. Book 4 The Age of Diverging Tradition. Chapter 2 The Arab Empires. Another important breakaway within the Arab world came when the Fatimids from Tunisia set up their own caliph and moved their capital to Cairo in 973. The Fatimids were Shiites and maintained their government of Egypt until a new Arab invasion destroyed it in the 12th century. Less conspicuous examples could be found elsewhere in the Abbasid dominions as local governors began to term themselves Amir and Sultan. The power base of the caliphs narrowed more and more rapidly. They were unable to reverse the trend. Civil wars among the sons of Harun led to a loss of support by the religious teachers and the devout. Bureaucratic corruption and embezzlement alienated the subject populations. Recourse to tax farming as a way round these ills only created new examples of oppression. The army was increasingly recruited from foreign mercenaries and slaves. Even by the death of Harun's successor, it was virtually Turkish. Thus, barbarians were incorporated within the structure of the caliphates as had been the Western barbarians within the Roman Empire. As time went by, they took on a Praetorian look and increasingly dominated the caliphs. And all the time, popular opposition was exploited by the Shiites and their mystical sects. Meanwhile, the former economic prosperity waned. The wealth of Arab merchants was not to crystallize in a vigorous civic life such as that of the late medieval West. Abbasid rule effectively ended in 946 when a Persian general and his men deposed a caliph and installed a new one. Theoretically, the line of Abbasids continued, but in fact, the change was revolutionary. The new Uwayyad dynasty lived henceforth in Persia. Arab Islam had fragmented. The unity of the Near East was once more at an end. No empire remained to resist the centuries of invasion which followed, although it was not until 1258 that the last Abbasid was slaughtered by the Mongols. Before that, Islamic unity had another revival in response to the Crusades, but the great days of Islamic empire were over. The peculiar nature of Islam meant that religious authority could not long be separated from political supremacy. The caliphate was eventually to pass to the Ottoman Turks, therefore, when they became the makers of Near Eastern history. They would carry the frontier of Islam still further afield and once again deep into Europe. But their Arab predecessors' work was awe inspiring, vast for all its ultimate collapse. They had destroyed both the old Roman Near East and Sassanid Persia, hemming Byzantium into Anatolia. In the end, though, this would call Western Europeans back into the Levant. The Arabs had also implemented Islam ineradicably from Morocco to Afghanistan. Its coming was in many ways revolutionary. It kept women, for example, in an inferior position, but gave them legal rights over property not available to women in many European countries until the 19th century. Even the slave had rights, and inside the community of the believers there were no castes nor inherited statuses. This revolution was rooted in a religion which, like that of the Jews, was not distinct from other sides of life, but embraced them all. No words exist in Islam to express the distinctions of sacred and profane, spiritual and temporal, which our own tradition takes for granted. Religion is a society for Muslims, and the unity this has provided has outlasted centuries of political division. It was a unity both of law and of a certain attitude. Islam is not a religion of miracles, though it claims some, but of practice and intellectual belief. Besides, having a great political, material, and intellectual impact on Christendom. Islam also spread far beyond the world of Arab hegemony to Central Asia in the 10th century, India between the 8th and 11th, and in the 11th beyond the Sudan and to the Niger. Between the 12th and 16th centuries, still more further of Africa would become Muslim. Islam remains today the fastest growing faith of that continent. Thanks to the conversion of Mongols in the 13th century, Islam would reach China. In the 15th and 16th century, it spread across the Indian Ocean to Malaya and Indonesia. Missionaries, migrants, and merchants carried it with them. The Arabs, above all, whether they moved in caravans into Africa or took their dhows from Persian Gulf and the Red Sea to the Bay of Bengal. There would even be a last final extension of the faith in the Southeast Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. It was a remarkable achievement for an idea at whose service there had been in the beginning no resources except those of a handful of Semite tribes. But in spite of its majestic record, no Arab state was ever again to provide unity for Islam after the 10th century. Even Arab unity was to remain only a dream, though one cherished still today. Chapter 3, Byzantium and its Sphere. In 1453, 900 years after Justinian, Constantinople fell into an infidel army, there has never been and there never will be a more dreadful happening, wrote one Greek scribe. It was indeed a great event. No one in the West was prepared. The whole Christian world was shocked. More than a state, Rome itself was at an end. The direct descendant from the classical Mediterranean civilization had been snapped at last. If few saw this in quite so deep a perspective as the literary enthusiasts who detected in it retribution for the Greek sack of Troy, it was still the end of 2000 years' tradition. And if the pagan world of Hellenistic culture and ancient Greece were set aside, 1,000 years of Christian empire at Byzantium itself was impressive enough for its passing to seem an earthquake. This is one of those subjects where it helps to know the end of the story before the beginning. Even in their decline, Byzantine prestige and traditions had amazed strangers who felt through them the weight of an imperial past. To the end, its emperors were Augusti and its citizens who called themselves Roman. For centuries, Saint Sophia had been the greatest of Christian churches, the Orthodox religion it enshrined needing to make fewer and fewer concessions to religious pluralism as previously troublesome provinces were swallowed by the Muslims. Though in retrospect it is easy to see the inevitability of decline and fall, this was not how the men who lived under it saw the Eastern Empire. They knew, consciously or unconsciously, that it had great powers of evolution. It was a great conservative tour de force which had survived many extremities, and its archaic style was almost to the end able to cloak important changes. Nonetheless, 1,000 years brought great upheavals in both East and the West. History played upon Byzantium, modifying some elements in its heritage, stressing others, obliterating others, so that the empire was, in the end, very different from Justinian's while never becoming wholly distinct from it. There is no clear dividing line between antiquity and Byzantium. The center of gravity of the empire had begun to shift eastward before Constantine, and when his city became the seat of the world empire, it was the inheritor of the pretensions of Rome. The office of the emperors showed particularly sharply how evolution and conservatism could combine. Until 800, There was no formal challenge to the theory that the emperor was the secular ruler of all mankind. When a Western ruler was hailed as an emperor in Rome that year, the uniqueness of the imperial purple of Byzantium was challenged. Whatever might be thought and said in the East about the exact status of the new regime, yet Byzantium continued to cherish the fantasy of universal empire. There would be emperors right to the end, and their office was one of awe inspiring grandeur. Still, theoretically chosen by Senate, army, and people, they had nonetheless an absolute authority. While the realities of his accession might determine for any particular emperor the actual extent of his power, and sometimes the dynastic succession broke under the strains. He was autocrat as a Western emperor never was. Respect for legal principle and the vested interests of bureaucracy might muffle the emperor's will in action, but it was always supreme in theory. The heads of the great departments of state were responsible to no one but him. This authority explains the intensity with which Byzantine politics focused at the imperial court. For it was there, and not through corporate and representative institutions such as evolved slowly in the West, that authority could be influenced. Autocracy had its harsh side. The secret police informers who swarmed through the empire were not there for nothing, but the nature of the imperial office also laid obligations on the emperor. Crowned by the patriarch of the Constantinople city, the emperor had the enormous authority, but also the responsibility of God's representative upon earth. The line between lay and ecclesiastical was always blurred in the East, where there was nothing like the Western opposition of church and state as a continuing challenge to unchecked power. Yet, the Byzantine scheme of things, there was a continuing pressure upon God's vice regent to act appropriately, to show philanthropia, a love of mankind in his acts. The purpose of the autocratic power was the preservation of mankind and of the conduits by which it drew the water of life, orthodoxy and the church. Appropriately, most of the early Christian emperors were canonized, just as pagan emperors had been deified. Other traditions than the Christian also affected the office, as this suggested. Byzantine emperors were to receive the ritual prostrations of Oriental tradition, and the images of them, which looked down from their mosaics, show their heads surrounded by the nimbus in which the last pre Christian emperors were depicted, for it was part of the cult of the sun god. Some representations of Sassanid rulers have it too. It was nonetheless, above all, as a Christian ruler that the emperor justified his authority. The imperial office itself thus embodied much of the Christian heritage of Byzantium. That heritage also marked the Eastern Empire off sharply from the West at many other levels. There were, in the first place, the ecclesiastical peculiarities of what came to be called the Orthodox Church. Islam, for example, was sometimes seen by the Eastern clergy less as a pagan religion than a heresy. Other differences lay in the orthodox view of the relationship of clergy to society. The coalescence of spiritual and lay was important at many levels below the throne. One symbol of it was the retention of a married clergy. The Orthodox priest, for all his presumed holiness, was never to be quite the man apart his Western and Catholic colleagues became. This suggests the great role of the Orthodox Church as a cementing force in society down to modern times. Above all, no sacerdotal authority as great as that of the papacy would emerge. The focus of authority was the emperor, whose office and responsibility towered above the equally ranked bishops. Of course, so far as social regulation went, this did not mean that orthodoxy was more tolerant than the Church of the medieval West. Bad times were always liable to be interpreted as evidence that the emperor had not been doing his Christian duty, which included the harrying of such familiar scapegoats as Jews, heretics, and homosexuals. Distinction from the West was, in part, a product of political history, of the gradual loosening of contact after the division of the empires, in part, a matter of an original distinction of style. The Catholic and Orthodox traditions were on divergent courses from early times, even if at first the divergence was only slight. At an early date, Latin Christianity was somewhat estranged by the concessions the Greeks had to make to Syrian and Egyptian practice. Yet, such concessions had also kept alive a certain polycentrism within Christendom. When Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria, the other three great patriarchates of the East, fell into Arab hands, the polarization of Rome and Constantinople was accentuated. Gradually, the Christian world was ceasing to be bilingual. A Latin West came to face a Greek East. It was at the beginning of the 7th century that Latin finally ceased to be the official language of the army and of justice, the two departments where it had longest resisted Greek. That the bureaucracy was Greek speaking was to be very important. When the Eastern Church failed among Muslims, it opened a new missionary field and won much ground among the pagans to the north. Eventually, southeastern Europe and Russia were to owe their evangelizing to Constantinople. The outcome, among many others, was that the Slav people would take from their teachers not only a written language in a script based on Greek, but many of their most fundamental political ideas. And because the West was Catholic, the relations with the Slav world were sometimes hostile, so that the Slav people came to view the western half of Christendom with deep reservations. This lay far in the future and takes us further afield than we need to go for the present. The distinctiveness of the Eastern Christian tradition could be illustrated in many ways. Monasticism, for example, remained closer to its original forms in the East, and the importance of the holy man has always been greater there than in the more hierarchically aware Roman Church. The Greeks, too, seem to have been more disputatious than Latins. The Hellenistic background of the early church had always favored speculation, and the Eastern churches were open to Oriental trends, always susceptible to the pressures of many traditional influences. Yet, this did not prevent the imposition of dogmatic solutions to religious quarrels. Some of these were about issues which now seem trivial or even meaningless. Inevitably, a secular age such as our own finds even the greatest of them difficult to fathom, simply because we lack a sense of the mental world lying behind them. It requires an effort to recall that behind the exquisite definitions and logic chopping of the theologians lay a concern of appalling importance, nothing less than that mankind should be saved from damnation. A further obstacle to understanding arises for the diametrically opposed reason that theological differences in Eastern Christianity often provided symbols and debating forms for questions about politics and society, about the relationship of national and cultural groups to authority, much as hair splitting about the secular theology of Marxist Leninism was to mask practical differences between 20th century communists. There is more to these questions than appears at first sight, and much of it affected world history just as powerfully as the movement of the armies or even peoples. The slow divergence of the two main Christian traditions is of enormous importance. It may not have originated in any sense in theological division, but theological disputes propelled divergent traditions yet further apart. They created circumstances which make it more and more difficult to envisage an alternative course of events. One episode provides an outstanding example: the debate on Monophysitism, a doctrine which divided Christian theologians from about the middle of the 5th century. The significance of the theological issue is at first sight obscure to our post religious age. It originated in an assertion that Christ's nature while on earth was single. It was wholly divine, instead of dual, that is, both divine and human, as had generally been taught in the early church. The delicious subtleties of the long debates which this view provoked must, perhaps regrettably, be bypassed here. It is sufficient only to notice that there was an important non theological setting for the uproar of Ephthartodatists, Corruptocolists, and Theopaschists, to name a few of the contesting schools. One element in it was the slow crystallization of three Monophysite churches separated from Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. These were the Coptic Church of Egypt and Ethiopia, and the Syrian Jacobite and Armenian churches. They became, in a sense, national churches in their countries. It was in an endeavor to reconcile such groups and consolidate the unity of the empire in the face of the first Persian and then the Arab threat that the emperors were drawn into theological dispute. There was more to it. That is to say, then the special responsibility of the office first revealed by Constantine's presiding at the Council of Nicaea. The Emperor Heraclius, for example, did his best in the early 7th century to produce a compromise formula to reconcile the disputants over Monophysitism. It took the form of a new theological definition, soon called monothelitism, and on it, for a time, agreement seemed likely, though it was in the end condemned as Monophysitism under the new name. Meanwhile, the issue had pushed East and West still further apart in practice, though ironically the final theological outcome was agreement in 681. Monophysitism had produced a 40-year schism between Latins and Greeks as early as the end of the 5th century. This was healed, but then came the further trouble under Heraclius. The empire had to leave Italy to its own devices when threatened by the Arab onslaught, but both Pope and Emperor were now anxious to show a common front. This partly explains the Pope's endorsement of monothelitism, on which Heraclius had asked his view so as to quieten the theological misgivings of the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Pope Honorius, successor of Gregory the Great, supported Heraclius and so enraged the anti Monophysites that almost half a century later he achieved the distinction, unusual among popes, of being condemned by an ecumenical council at which even the Western representatives at the council joined in the decision. At a crucial moment of danger, Honorius had done much damage. The sympathies of many Eastern churchmen in the early 7th century had been alienated still further from Rome by his imprudent action. The Byzantine inheritance was not only imperial and Christian, it also owed debts to Asia. These were not merely a matter of the direct contacts with alien civilizations, symbolized by the arrival of Chinese merchandise along the Silk Road, but also of the complex cultural inheritance of the Hellenistic East. Naturally, Byzantium preserved the prejudice which confused the idea of barbarians with that of peoples who did not speak Greek, and many of its intellectual leaders felt they stood in the tradition of Hellas. Yet the Hellas of which they spoke was one from which the world had long been cut off, except through the channels of the Hellenistic East. When we look at that cultural region, it is hard to be sure how deep Greek roots went there and how much nourishment they owed to Asiatic sources. The Greek language, for example, seems in Asia Minor to have been used mainly by the few who were city dwellers. Another sign comes from the imperial bureaucracy and leading families, which reveal more and more Asian names as the centuries go by. Asia was bound to count for more after the losses of territory the empire suffered in the 5th and 6th centuries, for these pinned it increasingly into only a strip of mainland Europe around the capital. Then the Arabs hemmed it into Asia Minor, bounded in the north by the Caucasus and in the south by the Taurus. On the edges of this, too, ran a border always permeable to Muslim culture. The people who lived on it naturally lived in a sort of marcher world, but sometimes there are indications of deeper external influence than this upon Byzantium. The greatest of all the Byzantine ecclesiastical disputes, that over iconoclasm, had its parallels almost contemporaneously within Islam. The most characteristic feature of a complicated inheritance were set in the 7th and 8th centuries: an autocratic tradition of government, the Roman myth, the guardianship of Eastern Christianity, and practical confinement to the East. There had by then begun to emerge from the late Roman Empire the medieval state, sketched under Justinian. Yet, of these crucial centuries, we know little. Some say that no adequate history of Byzantium in that era can be written. So poor are the sources and so skimpy the present state of archaeological knowledge. Yet, at the start of this disturbed period, the empire's assets are clear enough. It had at its disposal a great accumulation of diplomatic and bureaucratic skills, a military tradition, and enormous prestige. Once its commitments could be reduced in proportion, its potential tax resources were considerable, and so were its reserves of manpower. Asia Minor was a recruiting ground which relieved the Eastern Empire of the need to rely upon Germanic barbarians as had been necessary in the West. It had a notable war making technology. The Greek fire, which was its secret weapon, was used powerfully against ships which might attack the capital. The situation of Constantinople, too, was a military asset. Its great walls, built in the 5th century, made it hard to attack by land without heavy weapons that were unlikely to be available to the barbarians. At sea, the fleet could prevent a landing. What was less secure in the long run was the social basis of the empire. It was always to be difficult to maintain the small-holding peasantry and prevent powerful provincial landlords from encroaching on their properties. The law courts would not always protect the small man. He was too under economic pressure from the steady expansion of church states. These forces could not easily be offset by the imperial practice of the land making grants to smallholders on condition that they supplied military service. But this was a problem whose dimensions were only to be revealed with the passage of centuries. The short term prospects gave the emperors of the 7th and 8th centuries quite enough to think about.